Elon Musk saves family thrown onto streets. What happens next is unreal. The air was thick with tension as James and Sophia Harris stood in front of their apartment building, the weight of the eviction settling heavily on their shoulders. They had been there for years. The apartment was their home, a place they had built their lives around. Now, standing in front of it with their children, Anna and Ben, looking at the mess of their belongings strewn across the sidewalk, it felt like the ground had been ripped from under them. The landlord's men had dumped everything onto the street, as if it was nothing more than garbage. Boxes, clothes, family photos, all scattered carelessly on the pavement. The building loomed behind them, a cold monument to their failure. "This can't be happening," Sophia whispered, her voice shaking. She had been trying to hold it together for the kids, but it was becoming increasingly harder. The reality of it all was too much to bear. How had everything fallen apart so quickly? James stood there, numb, staring at the building as if willing it to transform into something that could give them hope. He was a proud man, the kind who worked hard and took care of his family. But now, with his business tanking, the bills piling up, and the eviction notice in hand, he felt like a failure. He had promised Sophia and the kids that he would always provide for them. He had failed. The kids stood off to the side, Anna clutching a small suitcase, her eyes wide with confusion. Ben, barely old enough to understand, clutched his favorite toy, oblivious to the weight of the situation. James couldn't bear the look in Anna's eyes, the unspoken question that lingered in the air. "What happens now?" He forced a smile, but it was weak. "We'll figure it out," he said. But even as he spoke the words, he knew how hollow they sounded. Sophia knelt down to Anna's level. "We'll find a way, sweetheart. We're together, and that's all that matters." Anna nodded but said nothing. Ben, still unaware of the full gravity of the situation, tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Where's our new house, Mom?" he asked, his voice filled with innocence. Sophia felt a pang in her chest. We'll figure it out, Ben," she replied, her voice cracking. She stood, looking at James. He could see the same fear in her eyes, the fear that came from not knowing what the future held. Just then, a sleek black car pulled up, its engine purring softly as it came to a stop in front of the family. The window rolled down slowly, and out stepped none other than Mr. Pearson, the landlord. He was dressed in a crisp suit, his face impassive as he looked down at the family. His demeanor was one of superiority, as if he was above all of this. James' heart sank. The last time they had spoken, Pearson had promised to work with them, to give them more time. But now, standing here in front of them, it was clear he had no intention of honoring that promise. Well, Pearson said, his voice cold and patronizing. "I see you've made yourselves comfortable. It's a shame you couldn't make things work. But unfortunately, the place is mine now, and it's time to move on." James clenched his fists, trying to keep his anger in check. "You can't just do this to us, Pearson. You can't throw us out like this. We have nowhere to go." Pearson's lips curled into a sneer. "You should have thought of that before you couldn't pay the rent. People like you always want sympathy, but there's no room for that in this world. I gave you time. I gave you a chance to make things right. But you couldn't, could you?" Sophia took a step forward, her voice trembling with frustration. "We tried. We tried. You knew our situation. This isn't fair." Pearson stepped closer, his eyes narrowing with contempt. "Fair? You think life's fair? You think the world owes you something just because you've had a rough patch? Life doesn't work like that. You're lucky I didn't throw your stuff out sooner." James took a deep breath, trying to suppress the rage bubbling up inside him. "You're heartless. You don't care about anyone but yourself." Pearson chuckled darkly. "That's the problem with people like you. Always looking for someone to blame. You want a handout, but that's not how the world works. You'll get nothing from me." The words hit James like a punch to the gut. He wanted to lash out, to scream at Pearson, but he knew it wouldn't do any good. It never did. Instead, he stood there, the weight of the injustice settling heavily on his shoulders. Anna, watching the exchange, tugged at her father's sleeve. "Dad, what's happening?" Why is he being so mean? James knelt down to his daughter, his heart aching as he saw the fear in her eyes. It's okay, sweetie. He's just being selfish. He looked up at Pearson, the words barely escaping his lips. You've taken everything from us. You've ruined our lives. Pearson's face hardened. Your life is your responsibility, not mine. If you can't handle it, that's on you. He gave a dismissive wave of his hand. Good luck finding somewhere else. And don't even think about coming back here. I'll call the cops if I have to. With that, Pearson turned on his heel and walked back to his car, his expensive shoes clicking against the pavement. He didn't even spare them a second glance as he slid into the car and slammed the door shut. The car pulled away, disappearing down the street, leaving the Harris family standing in the middle of the sidewalk, lost and defeated. For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of Pearson's cruelty hung in the air, and the reality of their situation settled in. There was no way out. They were stuck, abandoned, and left to fend for themselves. Sophia wrapped her arms around Anna and Ben, holding them tightly. She buried her face in Anna's hair, fighting back tears. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. I don't know how to fix this. James stood there for a moment longer, staring at the empty street where Pearson's car had been. He was filled with a mixture of rage and helplessness, and all he could think about was how their lives had been torn apart by a single man's greed. Just as the hopelessness began to settle in, the sound of footsteps interrupted the heavy silence. James turned, his eyes searching for the source. It was a man in a suit, someone he didn't recognize. He wasn't tall, but his posture was confident, his expression unreadable. He looked familiar in some way, but James couldn't place him. The man stopped a few feet away from the family, watching them with a curious, almost calculating expression. James's pulse quickened. There was something about this man, something that didn't seem entirely random. But before he could react, the man spoke. Is everything okay here? The man asked calmly, his voice measured but with an undertone of authority. The man in the suit, Elon Musk, stood there, quietly observing the family with an air of curiosity. But James's mind was still focused on the harsh words the landlord had just thrown at them. The confrontation had hit a nerve, and he could feel his anger bubbling up again, threatening to spill over. The humiliation, the cruelty of the situation. It was all too much. Pearson, standing just a few feet away in his tailored suit, had just stripped them of everything, and now he was trying to make them feel like they didn't even deserve their own lives. James was the first to speak, his voice tight with barely restrained fury. You have no idea what it's like to be in our position, Pearson. You've never had to worry about where your next meal's coming from, where you're gonna sleep. You've never been desperate like we are. Pearson's lips curled into a smirk, and he slowly turned back toward James, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling mixture of pity and disdain. Desperate? You want sympathy? I'm not here to babysit you, Harris. I don't owe you anything. You've got no one to blame but yourselves. His words hung in the air, cruel and cutting. Every syllable felt like a slap in the face, a reminder that their struggles meant nothing to him. Pearson's expression hardened, his disdain becoming more apparent by the second. He stepped closer, leaning in slightly, as if trying to tower over James, even though the physical difference between them wasn't significant. You think you're special just because you've got a couple of kids? Pearson sneered, his voice lowering. That doesn't change the fact that you couldn't pay. That doesn't make you any less of a burden. His eyes flicked briefly to Sophia and the children, and then back to James. This is what happens when people can't keep up with their responsibilities. You're weak, and weakness gets thrown away. James clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles turned white. He wanted to throw a punch, to knock the smug look off Pearson's face, but he knew it would only escalate the situation. The landlord wasn't just some random stranger. They had a legal battle ahead of them, and violence would only make things worse. He forced himself to stay calm, his voice trembling slightly as he spoke. We're not weak. We've been fighting every single day. You don't get to decide who's worthy and who's not. You're just a man who owns a building. That's all you are. Pearson laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that echoed down the street. "Oh, I'm more than that, Harris. I own this street. I own this entire neighborhood. And people like you are expendable. You want to know the real truth? People like me don't need to worry about things like money or food or shelter. We control it all. You, on the other hand, are just lucky I didn't call the cops on you for trespassing. That would have been real trouble for you." The words stung. James could feel his cheeks flush with anger, but there was nothing he could do. Pearson had already won. He had kicked them out, stripped them of their dignity, and now he was rubbing salt in the wound. Sophia stood quietly beside James, her hands trembling at her sides, struggling to hold it together. She looked at Pearson with a mixture of disbelief and fury. "How can you talk to us like that? We're human beings. We're not just numbers to be discarded. We're a family." Pearson looked at her, his gaze cold, unfeeling. "Family? A family that can't pay the bills? That's not a family. That's just a burden." Anna, who had been standing quietly beside her mother, clenched her jaw, her eyes now hard with resentment. "You're horrible," she muttered, her voice sharp and cutting. "You don't even care." Pearson's eyes shifted to her, narrowing in an instant. "What did you say?" he asked, his tone dangerously quiet. Anna stood her ground, refusing to back down. "You don't care about anyone but yourself. You're just a selfish, heartless." Before she could finish, Pearson took a step forward, his voice turning icy. "Watch your mouth, little girl," he said, his tone low and menacing. "I'm not the one begging on the streets." James moved quickly to stand in front of Anna, his chest tight with the need to protect his family. "That's enough," he shouted, his anger finally boiling over. "You have no right to talk to my daughter like that. You think you can just bully us because you have money? Well, you're wrong. We might not have much, but we're still people. And we still matter." Pearson took a step back, a twisted smile spreading across his face. He clearly found James's outburst amusing. "Oh, I don't think I'm bullying you. I'm just giving you a dose of reality. You don't matter. You're nothing but a failure, Harris." He paused for a moment, letting the words hang in the air like poison. "And if you don't get your stuff off this sidewalk by the end of the day, I'll have it hauled away. Do you understand?" James's heart was pounding in his chest, the sting of Pearson's words making it hard to breathe. But even as his fists clenched, he knew he couldn't let the landlord win. Not in front of his kids. Not when he had to show them that they still had dignity, that they still had worth, even when Pearson tried to strip it from them. Pearson turned on his heel, dismissing them without another word. As he walked away, he didn't look back, as if they were already beneath his notice. His cruel words echoed in the air as he retreated, leaving James standing there with his family, shaking with the weight of it all. Sophia sank to her knees, her face in her hands as she began to sob quietly, her body racked with the weight of the hopelessness that had taken root inside her. Anna knelt beside her mother, rubbing her back gently, her own tears held back, but her fear evident. Ben, looking up at the street that seemed to stretch out endlessly, asked with a tremble in his voice, "Where are we going, Mom? What happens now?" Sophia wiped her eyes, trying to regain her composure. She couldn't lie to him. She couldn't make promises she couldn't keep. I don't know, Ben," she whispered, "but we'll be okay. We'll figure it out." But even she didn't believe the words anymore. As the family stood there, defeated, the harshness of their situation felt like a weight pressing down on them, suffocating them. There was nowhere to turn, and no one was offering them help. Just then, James glanced down the street, his eyes catching the figure of a man in a suit who was standing off to the side, observing them with a quiet intensity. Elon Musk. For a brief moment, it almost felt like the world had stopped. Everything was still, and for just a heartbeat, James considered the strange possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this nightmare. The air around them felt dense, as if it were pressing in on all sides, squeezing the family tighter and tighter. Pearson had walked away, but his words still hovered in the air, heavy and venomous. The family remained frozen in place, their emotions tangled between fury, confusion, and despair. James stood rooted to the spot, staring at the spot where Pearson had stood moments ago. His teeth were gritted so tightly that his jaw ached. He could feel the anger rising in his chest, an overwhelming tide that threatened to break free, but he wasn't sure what to do with it. The landlord had already stripped them of their home, their sense of security, and now he had the audacity to mock them, to tell them they were worthless. He glanced at Sophia, her shoulders shaking as she tried to hold herself together. Her hands were trembling, and James could see the weight of the world on her. She had been the strong one for so long, but now she was starting to crumble beneath the pressure. The kids were quieter than usual, Anna's face pale, her lips pressed tight in a thin line. Ben was still clutching his toy, his small body hunched with uncertainty. James felt his chest tighten as he looked at them. What was he supposed to do for them now? How could he protect them when there was nothing left to give? She gave James a shaky smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine. Let's just get everything packed up, okay?" James didn't respond immediately. His eyes were still locked on the spot where Pearson had stood, and his fists were clenched, his nails digging into his palms. There was a part of him that wanted to run after the landlord, to confront him, to do something, but he knew that would only make things worse. The cold, unfeeling eyes of Pearson had made it clear. They were nothing more than an inconvenience to him. "I can't believe he just walked away," James muttered, his voice low but filled with fury. He turned to Sophia, his voice rising now. "How can he be so heartless? He doesn't care that we've lost everything? We're not just numbers. We're a family." Sophia's eyes were full of sadness, but she stepped forward, trying to calm him down. "James, I know it's unfair, but yelling at him won't change anything. We just need to focus on what we can control." Her voice wavered, but she held her ground. "We've got to keep moving forward, for the kids." But James wasn't ready to let it go. His anger wasn't just directed at Pearson anymore. It was at the entire system that had left them stranded. "You think he cares about the kids? All he cares about is his damn profit. We're just another problem he wants to get rid of. That's all we are to him." Sophia took a deep breath, her voice becoming more measured. "James, I get it, but losing it like this won't help us. We need to figure out what to do next. For us, for the kids." Ben, his small voice trembling, spoke up. "Mom, Dad, are we going to be okay?" The question pierced through the tension like a sharp knife. Sophia kneeled down to Ben's level, brushing a strand of hair from his face, trying to mask the panic creeping into her own voice. "We'll be fine, sweetie. We're together and we'll figure this out. We always do." Anna, standing a little further off, was quiet for a long time, her face pale and distant. Finally, she spoke, her voice shaky but determined. "I just don't understand. Why is he doing this to us? We never did anything wrong." James's heart sank. She's right, he thought. They hadn't done anything wrong. They were just trying to survive, trying to make it through life, and yet here they were on the streets with nothing. "I don't know, honey," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. He walked over to Anna and Ben, kneeling down so they were all eye level. "I don't know why some people are so cruel. I just want to make sure you're okay. I don't want you to have to go through this." Anna's eyes softened as she reached for her father's hand, her voice quieter now. "I'm scared, Dad. What happens now?" "I don't know," James admitted, his voice breaking. The helplessness in his chest was suffocating. How could he protect his family when they had nothing left to fight with? The quiet moment was broken by a sound, distant, but growing closer. It was the sound of a car approaching, its engine humming steadily. James, already on edge, turned sharply, his eyes scanning the street. It was Pearson. He was driving back, and he wasn't alone. The car rolled to a stop near them, and as the engine cut off, the door opened. James's stomach dropped as Pearson stepped out, a smug look on his face. But this time, he wasn't alone. Two men stepped out of the car with him, both towering over Pearson. They were dressed in dark suits, their faces serious. One of them held a clipboard, the other a phone, glancing at it quickly before returning his attention to the family. Pearson didn't say anything at first. He just watched them with that same cold, calculating expression, like a predator circling its prey. The two men behind him looked as if they were prepared for whatever Pearson wanted to do next. They were his muscle, ready to enforce whatever decisions he made. "I told you," Pearson said, his voice low, his eyes never leaving James's. "This situation isn't going to resolve itself, Harris. You think I'm going to let you squat here, taking up space that could be used for something productive? You want to keep your things? Then you better get them out of here, now." James stood up, his body shaking with rage. "You can't keep doing this to us. We have rights, Pearson. You can't just take everything from us and push us around like this." But Pearson's lips curled into a smile, and it was clear he wasn't backing down. "Rights?" he chuckled, shaking his head. "Not when you've broken the rules. Not when you're nothing more than a nuisance." The two men behind Pearson moved a step closer, their presence imposing. The tension in the air thickened, and James felt his chest tighten. He wasn't sure what Pearson's next move would be, but the cruelty of the situation was beginning to dawn on him. "Listen, Harris," Pearson said, his voice cold. "You've got an hour to move your stuff or I'll have it removed for you. And believe me, I'll make sure it's the last time you set foot on my property. You'll be in the system and they won't care about your sob story. You'll be just another file to them." James's fists clenched once more, his pulse pounding in his ears. He looked back at Sophia, Anna, and Ben, their faces a mirror of the fear and confusion that had settled in his heart. This wasn't just an eviction. This was something more, something much darker. Pearson's men began moving toward their belongings, and James stepped forward, his feet heavy as he stood in front of them, trying to protect his family. "I'll be damned if you lay a finger on them," James growled, his voice low and filled with an animalistic rage. Pearson's smirk widened, his eyes gleaming with something cold and ruthless. "Move aside, Harris. You've already lost. This is just the final step." The oppressive weight of Pearson's words hung in the air, suffocating everything around them. James stood firmly between his family and Pearson's muscle, his heart pounding in his chest. The two men behind Pearson, tall, broad-shouldered, and unyielding, made no move to hide their intent. They were there to enforce the landlord's will, and James could feel their eyes on him like a predator stalking its prey. He glanced over his shoulder at Sophia, her face pale with fear, her hands trembling as she held Anna and Ben close to her. Anna looked up at him, her eyes filled with confusion, her lips pressed into a thin line. Ben clutched his toy tighter, his innocent face not fully understanding the danger they were in, but the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. "You don't have to do this, Pearson," James said through gritted teeth, his voice raw with emotion. "You've already won. You've taken everything from us. Why don't you just let us be? We've got nothing left." Pearson took a slow step forward, his eyes glinting with amusement as he regarded James. "Oh, you don't get it? Do you, Harris?" he sneered. "This isn't about winning. It's about control. It's about power. And you, he pointed at James with an almost cruel deliberation, are no longer in a position to negotiate." James's anger flared, a fire rising from deep within him. He wanted to lash out, to shout, to make Pearson feel the pain that he had inflicted on them. But he knew that would only make things worse. The landlord had already shown his willingness to humiliate them, to strip away their dignity at every turn. His eyes now gleamed with a sadistic pleasure at the family's misery. "You think this is fun for you?" James spat, his voice rising. "You think you can just throw us out, take everything from us, and get away with it? You think we're just supposed to roll over and accept it?" Pearson smiled, a wicked, self-satisfied grin that made James's blood boil. "You want to fight me, Harris?" he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You think you're going to get anywhere with that? Look around. You're outnumbered, outgunned. You're nothing but a nuisance. And nothing matters in this world but money, power, and control. You've got none of that." The words struck James like a blow to the chest, but he refused to back down. He straightened, standing tall despite the fear gnawing at him. He had to protect his family. He couldn't let Pearson take everything, not without a fight. Sophia, her face now a mask of determination, stepped forward. "We've lost enough. We've fought long enough. But this is too much." Her voice shook, but there was a fire in her eyes, a glimmer of the woman she had once been, the one who would never let anyone break her. "We won't let you do this to us. We won't let you break us." But Pearson only laughed, a dark, humorless sound. "You think you have any say in this?" he sneered. "Look at you. You're nothing. You don't have the resources, the power. You can't win. Not in this world. Not against people like me." The two men behind him exchanged a brief glance before one of them stepped forward, pushing past James with a strength that sent him stumbling back. "Get out of the way, Harris," the man growled, his voice low and threatening. "You've already been warned. Do yourself a favor and don't make this harder than it needs to be." James's heart pounded in his chest as the man towered over him. He wasn't sure what was coming next, but his instinct told him that this wasn't going to end well. Every fiber of his being screamed to resist, to fight back, but the fear of what might happen to his family, what might happen to Anna and Ben, held him back. "Please," Sophia's voice broke through, desperate. She reached out to the man, her eyes wide with fear. "Please just stop. We'll leave. We'll go. Just let us keep our things." But Pearson's laughter cut through her plea. "You've already overstayed your welcome. And as for your things, well, they're not yours anymore. You'll have to find somewhere else to put them. This whole situation is done." The words stung, their finality sinking in. James felt the walls closing in around him, the weight of it all becoming unbearable. But he wouldn't let it end like this. Not with his kids watching. Not with Sophia trembling beside him. "You won't get away with this," James said, his voice low, but filled with an intensity that he hadn't felt before. "We'll find a way. You're not gonna just throw us away. Not like this." But Pearson's smile only widened. He stepped back, signaling to the two men behind him. "Move them," he said coldly. The men advanced, their movements calculated and sure. One of them reached for the boxes James had stacked near the sidewalk, while the other moved to grab a few of the personal items that had been left behind. James took a step forward, but before he could act, the man who had stepped past him earlier grabbed his arm, forcing him back. "No more talking," the man growled. "Move it. Now." The weight of the situation hit James like a freight train. There was no fighting them. They were too powerful, too well prepared. The anger in his chest threatened to explode, but the fear of what would happen to his family kept him still. Sophia had stepped back, her hand on Anna's shoulder as they watched helplessly. Ben still clutched his toy, his wide eyes filled with confusion and terror. "Dad?" Ben's voice broke through the chaos, a soft, frightened whisper. "Are we gonna be okay?" The question twisted James's insides. He had no answer. He could only stand there, paralyzed by the crushing realization that Pearson was in control. The landlord had won, and they had lost. Pearson, satisfied with the unfolding scene, turned his back to them. "I'll have the rest of it moved out by the end of the day," he said, his tone final. "You'll be out of my sight. Permanently." As Pearson and his men began their work, James could only stand there, watching in helpless fury. His world was slipping away, piece by piece, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The scene had grown increasingly chaotic, the sense of powerlessness growing thicker with each passing second. Pearson stood, a silent observer, as his men moved in and began systematically sifting through the family's belongings, tossing what was deemed unnecessary into the back of a truck that had just pulled up. The grinding sound of metal against asphalt, the hollow thud of boxes being thrown onto the street. It all echoed in James's mind like a steady drumbeat, the rhythm of his own defeat. His eyes darted around the park, scanning the space as if searching for some way out, some escape. The realization was crushing. There was no escape, not from Pearson, not from the situation, and certainly not from the cold reality that had descended upon them so suddenly. Sophia was silent now, her arms wrapped tightly around Anna, her face drawn and pale. She was still shaking, but now there was an eerie calm in her expression. James knew what that meant. She had given up just like he had. Her resolve was crumbling, and she couldn't bring herself to pretend anymore. She couldn't hide the fear anymore. James, on the other hand, could feel the rage surging again. Every time he looked at Pearson, standing there with his hands tucked into his pockets, watching the family's world get destroyed before his very eyes, it pushed him further into a place he didn't want to go. The rage was dangerous. It made his muscles tighten, his thoughts scatter in disarray. But the anger didn't change anything. It didn't change the fact that Pearson had power over them. It didn't change that he had already won. Ben, who had been quietly watching the men move their things, suddenly looked up, his face scrunched in confusion. "Why are they taking our stuff, Dad?" His voice was small and trembling, a stark contrast to the angry tension in the air. The question stung. It was a reminder of just how powerless they were in this moment. James crouched down beside him, doing his best to keep his voice calm, though it cracked slightly as he spoke. They're taking our things because we don't have a place to put them right now, Ben. But we'll figure it out. Promise." Ben's eyes were filled with a mixture of confusion and trust. He didn't understand what was happening. He didn't understand that their world had just been torn apart in front of him. The innocence in his eyes made James' heart ache. Elon Musk stood at the edge of the scene, still watching but saying nothing. He had been quiet throughout the entire exchange, observing the destruction of the family's life, yet offering no help. He was still a mystery, someone who had stepped into their lives in the strangest, most unexpected way, and yet hadn't yet done anything to stop the ongoing devastation. Pearson noticed the man's lingering presence and shot him a cold glance, his irritation clear. "You still here, Musk?" he said with an edge to his voice. "You don't get to play the hero just because you're famous. You have no say in this." Elon didn't flinch. He didn't respond immediately, his gaze shifting from Pearson to the family, who were now standing off to the side, visibly shrinking under the weight of what was happening to them. It was almost as if Elon was considering something important, and the tension of the moment was palpable. But Pearson wasn't done. He took a step toward Elon, his voice dripping with condescension. "You want to make a big show of yourself, Musk? Fine. But you know nothing about people like them." He motioned dismissively toward the family, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can just waltz in here and fix everything? You think your money can make everything better?" Elon met his gaze, his face betraying little emotion. "I don't think everything can be fixed by money, Pearson. But you don't have to do this. You don't have to tear apart a family just to get ahead." His voice was calm, but there was something steely in his words, something that seemed to make Pearson's confidence waver just slightly. Pearson's lips curled into a cruel smile. "I'm not interested in your little speeches, Musk. These people are nothing. They're weak, and you're wasting your time. If you think you can just throw money at this and it'll go away, you're wrong. People like them don't deserve your help." Elon's eyes hardened for a moment, but then he took a step back, his hands raised slightly, as if signaling that he wasn't going to engage any further. "You're right. They don't deserve this. But that's not the point." James looked up at Elon, confused. What's he waiting for? Why hadn't he said anything more? Why hadn't he stepped in sooner to stop this? He was Elon Musk, for crying out loud. The weight of his silence felt like a slap to James's face. Was this just a game to Elon? Another good deed for his image? Or did he really mean what he said? James turned back to Pearson, his fists clenched at his sides. "You're not going to stop, are you?" he asked, the words heavy with a bitter resignation. "You're not going to let us walk away with any dignity, are you?" Pearson's eyes flickered with something close to satisfaction. "Dignity? You lost that the moment you failed to pay rent. I am the one with dignity here. I'm the one in charge." Sophia took a deep breath, her voice trembling with the effort to keep calm. "This isn't about dignity anymore. This is about humanity. You're breaking us, Pearson, and you don't even care." The landlord didn't respond immediately. Instead, he waved a hand dismissively, signaling to his two enforcers to finish packing up the family's belongings. They didn't speak. They simply moved with mechanical precision, taking whatever they could find and tossing it into the truck, showing no mercy. "Do what you have to do," Pearson muttered, Get it over with. Sophia stepped forward, her voice shaky but insistent. You can't just steal everything we have. These are our memories. This is our life. Pearson turned to face her, and for the first time, there was something dangerous in his gaze. Do you think I care about your life? He spat. You're nothing, and nothing will ever change that. James stepped forward, his body shaking with the need to lash out. His hands clenched into fists, his body stiff with the rage he was trying so hard to hold back. He was done with this, done with Pearson's cruelty, done with the way the landlord had treated his family. Just stop, James finally shouted, his voice raw with emotion. Enough, just leave us alone. You've already taken everything from us. What more do you want? But Pearson didn't answer him. He simply nodded to his men, who continued to strip them of whatever little dignity they had left, throwing boxes into the back of the truck as if they were garbage. As they worked, Pearson turned to leave, already done with the whole ordeal, leaving the Harris family standing there, utterly defeated. The truck doors slammed shut with finality, and Pearson's car sped away, leaving them in the dust. And still, no one had said a word about how this would end. No one had come to offer them help. They were completely alone, with only the remnants of their former lives scattered across the street like broken dreams. The family stood frozen, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what had just transpired. Their belongings, everything they had left in this world, were now packed away in a truck that was quickly vanishing down the street. The bitter taste of defeat was thick in the air, and the weight of helplessness settled heavily on James's chest. He had fought with everything he had, but in the end, Pearson's cold authority had crushed them. Sophia was silent, her gaze distant as she held Anna and Ben close to her. The children had stopped asking questions, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. They could sense the change in the air, the finality of the situation. But none of them had the words to explain what had just happened. Elon Musk was still standing on the periphery, his eyes watching the family with a look that James couldn't quite place. It wasn't pity, it wasn't sympathy, it was something calculating, something that made James feel even more exposed, even more vulnerable. Elon had stepped in, but he hadn't done anything to stop the landlord from completely upending their lives. He was there, but he was still a stranger, still a figure on the outside. And James didn't know whether to feel relief or anger that Elon was there, watching, but doing nothing. Is there anything else you need? Elon's voice broke the silence, but his tone was too soft, too controlled to feel like a true offer. It was a question without the urgency that James had expected. Like a man who was used to controlling every aspect of his life but wasn't truly willing to intervene when it mattered. James turned to face him, his fists still clenched from the previous confrontation. The rage he had been holding back threatened to spill over, but this wasn't the time. He had to stay calm, for Sophia, for Anna, for Ben. They needed him to stay strong, even if his heart felt like it was breaking with every breath. What do you mean, anything else we need? James's voice was strained, but there was an edge to it, a quiet frustration simmering beneath the surface. You watched it happen. You saw everything. Everything we had is gone, and now you want to ask us if we need something? Elon didn't flinch at James's words, but there was a flicker in his eyes, an acknowledgement of the weight of the situation. I saw what happened. I know, and I'm sorry. He paused, his hands clasped in front of him, as if debating whether or not to continue. But there's not much I can do at the moment. Pearson's got the legal backing, and there's not much anyone can do once the paperwork is signed. James's chest tightened as he took in Elon's words. The words echoed in his mind like a cruel reminder of how powerless he really was in this moment. Pearson had already sealed their fate. The battle was over, and James was left standing in the wreckage of his family's life. And now Elon Musk, someone who could change the world with a single tweet, was telling him there was nothing that could be done? Sophia looked at Elon, her eyes red from crying, but there was a hardness to her gaze now, something that had been missing before. It was the look of someone who had been beaten down too many times to remain soft. You're telling us there's nothing you can do? She asked, her voice trembling, but not from fear. Anger burned behind her words. You can't help us? You, Elon Musk, can't help us? Elon's expression didn't change. He stood there, calm, composed, almost detached. But his words carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. What you're asking for isn't as simple as handing over a check or giving you a home. There are processes, procedures, lawyers. There's a lot more to it than just offering you a place to stay. Sophia's hands balled into fists, her voice barely above a whisper. You've got all the money in the world, and you're telling us that you can't do something real to help? That this is out of your hands? Elon took a step forward, his hands still clasped, his voice lowering as if he were trying to explain something difficult. It's not that simple. You have no idea what goes on behind closed doors. Pearson has his own legal team. This situation is about much more than just helping you. And he stopped, then, and for a moment, the silence between them felt like a wall, cold and unyielding. James stared at Elon, wondering what was going on in his mind, wondering why he hadn't just taken a more direct approach, why he was so detached, so clinical, as though this was just another situation to manage rather than a family's future hanging in the balance. Anna, who had been quiet up until now, spoke softly, her voice filled with a sadness that cut through the air. You promised you'd help us, she said, her words so simple, but they carried so much weight. You promised. The words hung in the air, their simplicity only making the sting worse. James's heart tightened, a lump forming in his throat as he realized that his daughter, too, had begun to lose faith in people, in strangers who promised help but never delivered, in the system that continued to crush them no matter how hard they tried. Elon shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable, but his response was delayed, as if he hadn't expected Anna's words to cut so deeply. I do want to help, he said, his voice quiet now, but there are limits to what can be done. Sometimes it's not just about one person coming in and fixing everything. Sometimes you have to go through the right channels to make sure the right thing happens. Sophia shook her head, her anger rising once more. You talk about channels and procedures like they matter. Do you think that's what we need right now? Do you think we need to hear about more rules, more bureaucracy? What we need is action. What we need is someone to fight for us. And all we've gotten so far is empty words. James felt his chest tighten even more, the growing bitterness threatening to swallow him whole. He wanted to say something, to shout, but he wasn't sure what. It felt like the words would only make things worse. Elon stood there, taking in their words, but he still didn't move, didn't seem to know what to say. Finally, after a long silence, he took a deep breath. I can try, he said finally, almost as if speaking to himself. But understand, this is going to take time. Pearson has the legal right to do what he's doing. And right now, the best I can do is help you get a fresh start. I can provide resources. I can put you in touch with the right people. But it won't be a quick fix. Sophia shook her head again, the frustration and anger building up. Time? You're telling us we have to wait for more time. Her voice was strained, desperate. We don't have time. We don't have anything anymore. James looked at Elon, feeling his heart break as he realized that no matter what the man in front of him said, no matter how much money he had or how much power he wielded, he couldn't undo the damage that had already been done. Pearson had already crushed them, and now here was Elon, offering them something vague and uncertain. Promises that were as fragile as the air they breathed. For the first time in a long while, James felt the anger in his chest slowly burn away, leaving only a hollow ache. He was so tired. Tired of fighting, tired of hoping for something that would never come. I'll do what I can, Elon repeated quietly, as if trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. But it's going to be a fight, and you might not like what it takes to win. James said nothing. He didn't know what else there was to say. Elon Musk, who had stood quietly up until now, seemed to finally sense the enormity of what was unfolding. He looked at the family, at their broken expressions, and, for the first time, his usual calm demeanor seemed shaken. He wasn't used to being in situations like this, not ones where money or power couldn't fix everything with the snap of his fingers. He had seen the world's flaws, but this was different. This wasn't just about fixing a business deal. This was about people. This was about their lives. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He had spent so much of his life solving problems, looking at everything from a detached, logical perspective, but what was happening here wasn't something that could be solved with logic. It couldn't be fixed with a donation or a few well-placed resources. The problem ran deeper than that, and no amount of money could undo the years of neglect and injustice that the family had suffered. I can't fix this overnight, Elon said, his voice quieter than before, as though he was speaking to himself more than to them. He took a step forward, but his words didn't carry the same force they had earlier. I can get you help, but you're right, Sophia. I'm not here to just throw money at the problem. And you're right to be angry. You deserve more than just promises. James finally spoke, his voice ragged with the exhaustion of fighting for so long. We've been living on promises for too long. Musk, we don't need more empty words. His voice cracked as he looked down at the ground, the weight of their struggle nearly too much to bear. You've got all the power in the world, but it doesn't change what's already been done. Pearson, he's already taken everything. We're just a footnote to him, to everyone, and I don't know how much more we can take. Elon's eyes softened, and for the first time, James saw a glimpse of something else, something human, beneath the surface of the billionaire. A flicker of understanding. Elon had always been a man of big ideas and even bigger actions, but in this moment, he realized there was no quick fix. There was no blueprint for what to do when someone was crushed under the weight of a broken system. Look, Elon began, his voice steady but uncertain. I can't promise that everything will change immediately, but I can promise that I'll fight this. For you, for your family. He paused, glancing at the children, who were still standing quietly, taking it all in. I'll make sure Pearson answers for what he's done. He doesn't get to treat people like this. Not on my watch. James looked at Elon, the anger still simmering inside him. But there was something else now, something he hadn't felt in a long time. It was hope, a fragile thing, but a glimmer of it, nonetheless. He wasn't sure how this would play out, but for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a chance. You'll fight him? James asked quietly. You'll really fight him? Elon nodded, his expression resolute. Yes, we'll get your things back. We'll make sure you have a place to stay. And I'll make sure Pearson doesn't get away with this. The words hung in the air, heavy with promise. And for the first time, James allowed himself to breathe, even if just for a moment. It wasn't the perfect solution. It wasn't the fairy tale ending he had always imagined. And for now, that was enough. The family stood together, no longer completely defeated, but ready to fight. Together,